A few years back, white Americans were asked whether or not we believed that racial discrimination was still a significant national problem for people of color, or whether it was just a problem, you know, like junk mail. Wrong phone number, 2 in the morning, you can't get back to sleep, it's raining and you want to go outside for a jog, you know, a problem. But one you'll get over, you know. Whether it wasn't much of a problem, wasn't a problem at all, we just weren't sure. They also asked black and brown folk this question. Folks of color, it won't surprise you, said, yes, it is a significant problem, actually, and not just because I read about it in a sociology textbook. I actually have lived it and would be more than happy to tell you what kind of problem it's been. And they asked white folks, is it or is it not a significant national problem, racial discrimination for people of color and against people of color? And only 6%, 6 out of 100 said yes, that it was a significant national problem. Just to give you an idea of how bad that is, I would have you compare it to a survey taken a few years earlier where approximately 12% of white Americans said we believed there was a fairly decent chance that Elvis Presley might still be alive. I don't know how good you are at math. I'm not very good myself, but that's a ratio that I can calculate. What that means is that white Americans are twice as likely to believe that Elvis might still be alive than we are to believe what people of color tell us they experience on a fairly regular basis. That is denial so profound as to boggle the mind, but there it is. And the people who are saying it are not mean-spirited, they're not hard-hearted, they're not bad people. I firmly believe that most people are good people. I could be wrong about this, but I have 2 little girls, ages 6 and 4, and I choose as a parent to believe that most people are good. If you have evidence to the contrary, keep it to yourself. I do not want to know it or hear it this evening. What I do know is that those individuals who said that, as well-meaning as they may have been, that they really didn't see it as a significant problem, aren't new in their denial. See, it's one thing for young people to think that the problem is solved. I almost get that. I almost understand it, because if you're under the age of 25, maybe even under the age of 35, what you know, what we tend to know, younger people, about this history and about this legacy is what we see in that grainy black and white footage every MLK Day, or maybe during Black History Month. If I were to ask you, do you believe that folks of color had equal opportunity and were treated equally in this country in 1963? Or whether or not black children were treated equally in schools and had equal educational opportunity in 1962, I know right now that no one in here would say, well, of course, you know, naturally they did. 1963, that was a damn good year to be black or brown in America. What are you talking about? Everyone, regardless of your position about 2007, would quickly acknowledge how bad it was back in the day, because it's no sweat off your back. 44, 45 years later, it's easy to talk about how bad it was, but now see, here's the trick. What do you think white folks said when those very questions were put to them in 1963 and in 1962? At a time when the apartheid system in this country was very much in full effect. It was before the Civil Rights Act, before the Voting Rights Act, before the Fair Housing Act. In retrospect, we can all look back and say how profoundly unequal it was. How profoundly unequal it was. And yet when white folks were asked, some of them our parents, our grandparents, great uncles, great aunts, these ancestors of ours, right, were asked the very same question in 1963. Do you think that people of color, they didn't use that term, it said racial minorities. Do you think that racial minorities are treated equally in your community? And 80% of white folks said yes. In 1962, when Gallup asked, do you think that black children receive equal educational opportunity in your community? 90% approximately of white folks said yes. Nothing to see here. What is all this complaining? What is this march on Washington? I don't get it. I don't understand it. In fact, the very month of that march, which now it seems like every white liberal wants you to believe they were at. The very month of that march, white folks were asked by Newsweek what they thought about it. They said, 2/3 of whites said that Dr. King and the movement were pushing too far, too fast, asking for too much, and too soon. The idea that this country was ready to hear this, even at the time when we know how vicious it was, is a lie. What does it say that white folks were in denial in 62 and 63? What does it say that if you've gone back to the 30s and asked the question? You think white folks were clear then? The 1890s, What did white folks say? Those southern editors of newspapers where I'm from, they would say, well, we get along fine with our Negroes down here if you Yankees would just leave us alone and stop messing in our business. Go back to 1850 and read what Dr. Samuel Cartwright, a well-respected member in good standing of the medical profession in this country, said. Not only was racism not a problem, there wasn't even a word for that yet, slavery wasn't a problem, so much so that he decided that any slave who would run away obviously had a mental illness. Because you'd have to be crazy to run away from bondage. So he came up with a term, he called it drapetomania. Don't even know what the root of that is, don't want to know, don't understand where the word came from, but that's what he called it, drapetomania. You must be crazy, you must be mentally ill to run away from your loving master. Denial. In every generation, 2007, 1963, the 30s, the 1890s, the 1850s, my point being that in every generation, members of the dominant group have said there is no problem. And in every generation, without fail, we have been wrong. And in every generation, people of color, those who are the targets of that oppression and subordination, have said there is a problem. And in every generation, without fail, they have been right. So the question for us today is, what are the odds, honestly, that people of color who have never gotten it wrong have suddenly lost their frickin' minds and have suddenly become unable to see truth and to separate it from fiction? And counter to that, what are the odds that white folks who have never gotten it right yet have suddenly become highly, highly perceptive? The odds are pretty long. And again, it's not because white folks are insensitive or hard-hearted, let alone stupid, but it is that those of us who are white have the luxury of not knowing black and brown truth.